All right, Joshua 7, let's call this one Presumption and subtitle it, They Are Few, because that is literally going to come out of the passage in which Israel is moving forward in battle, but they are going to have a major hiccup on the way because Joshua is going to send spies out to spy out the next town, unaware that a man by the name of Achan, who we mentioned before, has taken things from the previous battle at Jericho that he should not have taken. And so unaware, Joshua sends out the spies, presuming that because Ai is a smaller city, they'll need a smaller force. They advise Joshua, just send up a smaller force. Joshua takes their advice, sends up the smaller force, which is quickly routed and sent packing back home, which is going to send Joshua into something of a tailspin as he tears his clothes, goes in the morning, and asks God why. It's going to seem that he might be overreacting because they only lose roughly 36 soldiers, but he's not, because by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we're going to see that God is going to say that the nation has now become devoted to destruction. Why? Because he has already warned them that taking the devoted things can have consequences even beyond what they can immediately appreciate. And so the rest of the chapter is going to be devoted to confirming that Achan was the one who took the devoted things and then mitigating the damage of what he has done so that Israel can then move forward with God actually assisting their army as opposed to simply presuming that he's with them when he's not. But that whole concept of presumption goes back to things they were told in Deuteronomy when, in chapter 1, Moses is recounting the point at which God said, look, you're not going to get to go into the promised land, quite simply because you refuse to go. They're going to have second thoughts when they find out that the alternative is wandering in the wilderness until they're all dead. And so they're going to presume to go up without God, and much like the situation at Ai, they're going to get defeated in battle. Beyond that, in chapter 17, it's going to talk about verdicts rendered by either judges or priests in Israel's courts and the danger of presuming to disregard a verdict that is accurately rendered from God by his leaders. And then finally, on the flip side, chapter 18 is going to warn about the danger of a person who has an exalted status, specifically a prophet in Israel, presuming to deliver a word to the people that God hasn't actually spoken. In each situation, the thing that matters is the same. Is God with you or is he not? Because in battle, if God's not with you, you don't go. In a verdict, if it has actually been rendered accurately from one of God's leaders, you don't disregard it. And then finally, no matter how esteemed the position is, in chapter 18, a prophet, if a prophet has a great position but is uttering a word that God hasn't actually told him to speak, then it's dangerous to presume to speak a word that God has not spoken, especially if you're doing it on his behalf. So likewise, that is the same thing that they're dealing with here. Moving forward based upon the size of the adversary and not based upon whether or not God was actually with them. And it calls back to mind the repeated reminders that God gave them to be diligent in understanding what it was that God was and was not doing, so that they made sure that they stayed along the path that God was leading them. A very famous singer by the name of Bono, who's the front man for U2, a very popular group way back in the day, said something that caught my attention. I've used this quote before because he said, stop asking God to bless what you're doing. Find out what God's doing. It's already blessed. And in many ways, that sums up what's going on here in Joshua 7. Because in our lives, there are times when we can feel good about the thought that God is with us without being diligent to make sure that the things we're doing are consistent with him. And so in looking at the lesson from Joshua 7, even though they had a very embarrassing defeat in battle, as we mentioned before, sometimes it's better to have an immediate distressing stumble than to be allowed to drift along a path where we presume that God is with us when he really isn't. And for that reason, we often say his best to you as you go forward in him. This time, since what Bono has said seems to be very consistent with what God is teaching about diligence, not asking God to bless what we're doing as much as we're finding out what he's doing since it's already blessed. My prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we move along paths that are already blessed and not the paths that we presumptuously want God to endorse. His best to you as you go forward in him.